All right, everybody, welcome to this little mini introduction about various sorts of split systems. This is what we call them, as split systems in linguistics. A split system is someplace where is a language in which, for some reason, the subject and object alignment are inconsistent. For some reason, you can't just say this sentence is always ergative absolutive or this sentence is always nominative accusative, because there's something that changes around about it. So English can actually be thought of as kind of a split system. We wouldn't actually probably analyze it that way, but it had a lot of characteristics of a split system. So when we're using pronouns in English, we see in our intransitive sentence, we say he flew, he saw him. There's a difference between the subjects of both intransitives and transitives and the object of a transitive. This makes it a nominative accusative marking language. Wonderful, wonderful. We have a nominative accusative language, but then we look at examples where we're not using pronouns, and Tim doesn't have any special suffixes anywhere, and Jordan doesn't have any special suffixes anywhere, right? So this is a neutral marking system, right? We just have Tim flew, Tim saw Jordan. There's no suffixes, there's no case marking elsewhere in the system. So this is a split system because we have a nominative accusative pattern in some circumstances and a neutral pattern in other circumstances. This would probably technically not be analyzed as a split system once we start looking at the actual structure of it. But that is the pattern that we're seeing there is a split pattern. A lot of languages display something called split intransitivity. So when we were talking about ergative absolutive sentences, we labeled the subject of intransitives all as S, as though they're all the same, right? So these are all subjects of intransitive verbs, right? Bees fly, bees freeze. They're both intransitive sentences. But there's a difference between these two verbs. If you think about what semantic role is the bee performing in this sentence, the bee is not undertaking any sort of volitional action. It's actually sort of undergoing an action, right? So the bee is actually being frozen, right? Whereas here, the bee is voluntarily choosing to take off. So in a lot of ways, this acts like an agenty kind of thing, right? There's an agentive aspect to that, right? There's desire to fly, whereas in this, it sort of acts a little bit like a patient, right? It's undergoing something, right? So we can tell that because we can say things like the weather froze the bee, but it's a little bit weird to say the weather flew the bee, right? I mean, you can fly an airplane, but that's a little bit different, right? So these are two separate categories of intransitive verbs. This first category is what we usually think of when we think of intransitive verbs. These are called unergative verbs. This is a historical thing that these are called unaccusative and unergative. Totally confusing names, but we have to stick with them. So unergative ones are verbs like fly, run, dance, sing, scream, think. These are all things where you're engaging some sort of volition. You're intentionally you're intentionally performing some action. Unaccusative verbs are verbs like open, fall, freeze, starve, sink, and grow. A lot of these can be used transitively, and when they're used transitively, the thing when they're used intransitively is the well, that's a terrible way to phrase this sentence. So when we say, John opened the door, and then we make it the door opened. In an unaccusative verb, you take the thing that was the direct object and you make it the subject, right? So when you can use them in two ways, that's how you do it. With unergative verbs, you don't really, you're going to take, right? So you can say, John sang a song. And if you just want to make that intransitive, you still say John sang, right? So in both cases, John is still the subject. So these are two different types of verbs, and there are languages that mark these differently. Quite commonly, these unaccusatives get marked as absolutive and ergative absolutive languages, things like that, because these are sort of object-like, and these are sort of subject. These are more sort of transitive subject-like. So this is split intransitivity is when the unergative verbs and unaccusative verbs get marked differently. All right. The last kind is just general split ergativity. So split ergativity is quite common because ergativity in general is a little bit marked. It's a little more unusual to be an ergative language than to be a nominative accusative language. And so many languages that have ergativity have some portions of the language where they use nominative accusative marking. So there's a couple things that commonly make you use nominative accusative marking as opposed to your sort of normal ergative absolutive marking, and one of them is animacy. So, for example, if our animacy hierarchy says that humans are animate and non-humans are inanimate, then our ergative absolutive marking pattern might be beautifully shown in the bee flew and bees like flowers, right? We mark this as absolutive and this is ergative. But as soon as we start putting in humans, we start seeing a different marking pattern where the one with volition is doing the action. So this is a split ergative system, right? So we have for less animate things, we have an ergative absolutive, and for more animate things, we have a nominative accusative system. The other place where we often see split ergativity is in when the tense or aspect or mood changes. So this would be a circumstance like where you would say bees like flowers with ergative absolutive marking in the present tense, but bees liked flowers in the past tense. This is supposed to be accusative. So this happens commonly. You can change the aspect or the mood or the tense, and you see a change in the subject or object alignment. All right, so split systems, for various reasons, you get inconsistent subject and object alignment. There's a lot more possibilities here, but this is how we talk about these sort of weird patterns that we sometimes see with subject and object alignment, where it's not very clear exactly how the system is working. Thanks.